Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place. As for today, I'll be talking about Downed Daemon Studios Syntherapy, a visual novel that sees you playing therapist to a synthetic patient, hence the portmanteau. Join me as I sink into its story and ask the important questions, namely, if this tale was a trauma-inducing train wreck or a therapeutic experience. I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. In the late 2020s, a global economic collapse occurred as certain advancements in automation served as the swan song to countless employment opportunities. You take the role of one Melissa Park, a psychotherapist who grew up during those times, striving to do her utmost to help those in need. Which brings us to the current date, some 20 years later, when Mrs. Park's practice is in full swing and she's being introduced to her latest client, Willow. What sets Willow apart, however, is that she's not a human. Rather, she's a synthetic therapist, an AI whose caretaker suspects she's developed a nascent sentience, one which not only makes her status as university property problematic, but also comes with an additional caveat, as she's developed anomalous behavior that seems quite akin to self-harming. And thus, Miss Park finds herself needing to figure out not only how she can treat a digital entity, but what she wants a relationship with its various caretakers in the university to be like, and whether she can even abide the possible repercussions Willow may represent to the world at large. Or at least that was my justification for doing everything I could to see her dismantled during my second playthrough, but that's neither here nor there. Now, as a narrative experience, I did find the concept of syntherapy to be legitimately interesting, especially given the social work elements of the story didn't feel grossly inaccurate. Fun fact, I went to college for this noise, so it's nice to see it applied during this game. It's an interesting depiction of mental health and some of its realities as well. That said, despite the fact that I enjoyed exploring my initial playthrough and the ending I got for being oh so professional, I can't say the game treated me as well on my next playthrough, and part of that is simply how its gameplay / progression elements tie together. See, like most visual novels, the game is advanced through the choices you make. That said, you'd be hard-pressed to see the differences your choices make during the story. For instance, during my second playthrough, I did my best to be as abrasive as possible and decline the initial meeting. No go there. I then proceeded to continue being as abrasive as possible through the following days, but the overall dynamics with the various characters didn't change in any noticeable manner, nor did the emails I was sent that helped to sum up the events asked so far. Hell, there is a point in the game where one of the caretakers tries to sit in and on a therapy session, and while I declined in my initial playthrough, I forced that option through in my abrasive playthrough. But here's the thing, beyond the points it provides you towards your affinity with the characters involved, which are central to the endings, the ensuing emails and scenes play out the exact same. In essence, your choices during the game don't overly matter beyond what sort of epilogue you want. Yes, you can pick some different options in the next playthrough to further flesh out things, but it feels very samey as an experience, and that grated on me at a fundamental level. What's more, given the game does automatic checkpoints, you don't get the option of making convenient saves so you can explore a handful of endings. No, you need to commit to the process and thus become obliged to do everything from scratch if you want to see a slightly different outcome. I mean, there is a chapter selection option you can take, but it doesn't actually provide you any relationship values retroactively, so depending on how late you start things off, you can legitimately pigeonhole yourself into having a fast-track look at some of the bad endings. Though, at the same time, given the game does provide you twice as many character points for the first dialogue option you take in any of the segments that have a set number of questions you can ask, you could probably finagle at least a healthy ensemble of ending options if you simply dial it back a pair of chapters. I just didn't even have the motivation to do that by the end of it, which is a shame, really, since the developers clearly had replayability in mind for its player base. For instance, after you beat the game, you do gain access to an alternate game mode that tasks you with achieving a certain ending, or another which makes the ideal therapy type a specific kind and thus tasking you with figuring out the ideal route. The only problem being that the route to get there felt so rote. Also, given you have a log that traces the dialogue choices and the points they give, the former game mode mostly boils down to how much you feel like pulling out a piece of paper and journaling which dialogue choices you want to make. Legitimately, the biggest changes I got to see during a given run were choosing which caretaker I want to emphasize with, since they at least provided mutually exclusive scenes. But even that only really mattered for the first 2 runs. Past that, it was more of the same even when I mixed up caretaker meetings. So I suppose this has done a decent job of summing up the gameplay aspects of Syntherapy, though I suppose I can say I didn't mind the little pre-therapy minigames you could do to apparently get extra affinity points, or the quiz game you could take on your PC. There was also a butterfly hunt you could do by clicking around the scenes in search of hidden butterfly objects, which not only provided a hefty boost in my professionalism score in my relationship with another character when I found them all, it also unlocked gallery photos that I couldn't look at because trying to do so crashed my game. Yeah, so moving on, I do have to give the game's audio some credit. I genuinely enjoyed listening to the soundtrack as I proceeded along, and the ability to tweak with what was playing was certainly nice. The voice acting isn't too bad either. I personally enjoyed Willow as well as Dr. Freeman's voice, though Tara's voice actor occasionally grated on me. That said, the visual elements are perhaps the biggest mixed bag here for me. It's not necessarily bad, but there are moments where the facial expressions or the ilk just looked off to me, or where a character's age looked tremendously different from scene to scene. And that's really a small nitpick in the face of everything else, though. Again, I feel the need to iterate. I did enjoy my initial playthrough of the game, but the more I went through, the more I began to notice flaws in the fundamental gameplay and its storytelling, in Syntherapy's difficulty at maintaining suspension of disbelief due to the weird indifference it showed to the decisions I made during the game. And given that it's a game where its story is front and center, that meant a lot. At that point, the fact that it had an overabundance of endings meant very little if the journey to get there felt so repetitive, so empty. Like, yes, it's nice that I unlocked a page that showcased all the requirements I'd need to achieve an ending, that I could trace my various social relationships to figure out how to achieve it, and could track a path in the oncoming choices I was going to make. But that felt so utterly divorced from the actual process of advancing and making those choices. They simply didn't feel reflected, save in each scene. In fact, that's likely why I enjoyed the midway game over you can have when Willow has an episode. The ending you get there feels fairly organic. Unfortunately, I didn't get to explore that path further either, since it locks up at a black screen for me all 3 times I tried to follow through with it. And that's why I ultimately have to rate this game as a fail. At a very fundamental level, it's flawed. And whilst I like the ideas it presented, I did not enjoy being unable to really immerse myself in properly exploring them, given how distant I felt from the repercussions of my choices. Factor in a number of anomalous crash glitches, and that's why I can't even recommend this to someone specifically in search of visual novels or with an interest in mental health in gaming. And that wraps up today's episode, so thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know when there's a new release. For the Discord savvy folks, click the video description to find a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, and to my Patreon so you can support me and the other members of Crit Hit. Lastly, if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live, you can check out my Twitch at twitch.tv/Arlyeon when I stream. That said, I'll catch y'all on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.